When Black CEO Xavier Shaw returns to his small hometown of Millbrooke, he is confronted with blatant racism and systemic corruption, embodied by Officer Daniels, a prejudiced cop determined to undermine him. What begins as a mission to revitalize the town turns into a relentless fight against Daniels' abuse of power and the town's deep-seated biases. Arrested on false charges and publicly humiliated, Xavier's resolve is tested as he faces a community resistant to change. This gripping tale exposes the infuriating realities of racism in America and the uphill battle against entrenched prejudice and injustice. The city was alive with the hum of life, its neon glow painting the night in streaks of electric blue and crimson. Cars honked in a symphony of chaos, and the chatter of pedestrians echoed in the narrow alleyways. Yet, for all its vibrance, the city felt like a cold, unyielding maze to Kira, a young woman with weary eyes and a patched coat that hung loosely on her small frame. Kira crouched behind a dumpster, her breath visible in the chilly night air as she tightened her grip on a battered notebook. Inside its worn pages were sketches, bits of poetry, and fragments of dreams she dared to record, even as the weight of her reality threatened to crush them. Her stomach growled, but hunger was a familiar companion, one she had learned to ignore. She glanced around, scanning the crowd for a kind face, or at least a distracted one. The distant aroma of street food made her mouth water, but she couldn't risk being seen. Not after what had happened at the market last week. Accused of stealing, she'd barely escaped the angry vendor. Kira rubbed her bruised wrist, a grim reminder of her place in a world that refused to acknowledge her existence. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Across the street, a young man in a crisp suit stepped out of a sleek black car. He was tall, with sharp features and a confidence that seemed to part the crowd as he walked. Kira's gaze lingered on him, not because of his wealth, but because of the look on his face, a mixture of exhaustion and quiet determination. He didn't belong here, not in this part of town. So why was he here? Before she could stop herself, Kira stepped out of the shadows, clutching her notebook like a shield. She didn't know what she hoped to gain, help, maybe, or just a moment of kindness. She called out, her voice trembling against the city's relentless noise. "Sir! Please!" The man paused, turning to meet her gaze. For a moment, the world seemed to still, his piercing green eyes locking onto hers. There was no disdain in his expression, no judgment, just curiosity. Kira's heart raced, her grip on the notebook tightening as she took a step forward. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with concern. Kira hesitated. She wasn't lost, but she wasn't found either. And in that moment, she realized this encounter might be the start of something she couldn't yet understand. The golden glow of the setting sun poured through the tall windows of Xavier Shaw's office, casting long shadows across the sleek walnut desk. The air smelled faintly of leather and mahogany, punctuated by the sharp aroma of his untouched coffee. Outside, the world buzzed on, but within these walls, there was an uncanny silence. A silence Xavier cherished when he wasn't drowning in meetings or fielding calls from venture capitalists. Xavier leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie with one hand while scrolling through the latest quarterly reports on his tablet. A subtle smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It was a good year. His tech company, Innovate Solutions, had once again exceeded projections, and the local scholarship program he funded was helping more underprivileged students than ever. Yet for all his success, Xavier lived simply compared to most in his position. His suits were sharp but understated, his car a modest electric sedan. He drove himself, and instead of hosting extravagant galas in sprawling estates, he preferred small gatherings with close friends or quiet evenings with a book. It wasn't that he shunned wealth, he understood its utility, but he refused to let it define him. Tonight, however, Xavier wasn't thinking about stocks or algorithms. He was preparing for a drive back to Millbrooke, the small southern town he once called home. He hadn't visited in years, but he'd been drawn back by a sense of duty. The local economy was crumbling, businesses shuddering under the weight of outdated practices and systemic neglect. Xavier saw an opportunity, not just to invest, but to give back to the place that had shaped him, scars and all. By the time he stepped out of his downtown office, the streets were alive with the hum of evening traffic, The distant honk of car horns blended with the rhythmic clatter of subway trains, creating a symphony of the city. But as Xavier navigated toward the highway, the glimmering skyline gave way to the dense woods and narrow roads that heralded Millbrooke's outskirts. Here, the air grew cooler, quieter, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Millbrooke hadn't changed much. The old courthouse still loomed at the center of Main Street, its white columns faded, but proud mom-and-pop stores lined the sidewalks, their hand-painted signs weathered by years of sun and rain. Yet, as Xavier parked his car outside a small diner, he noticed the emptiness, boarded-up storefronts, and a handful of locals lingering outside, their faces etched with weariness. The diner, Millie's Place, was one of the few businesses still thriving, though it hadn't aged gracefully. Its neon sign flickered weakly, and the windows were fogged with condensation. Xavier stepped inside, his polished loafers tapping against the cracked linoleum floor. The smell of fried food and coffee hit him instantly, mingling with the low hum of chatter from a few scattered patrons. Heads turned as he walked in, their conversations pausing just long enough for him to notice. His crisp suit and confident stride stood out among the trucker hats and worn jeans, and he felt their eyes linger a little too long. Xavier was used to being the only black man in the room, but here, in this small-town diner, the weight of it pressed down harder. He approached the counter, where a waitress with tired eyes and a forced smile greeted him. Her name tag read, Becky. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "Just coffee, please, Black." Xavier slid into one of the stools, his frame too tall for the counter's low height. He folded his hands on the table, glancing around the room. At a corner booth, a group of older men played cards, their laughter punctuated by the clink of glasses. A couple at another table whispered to each other, stealing glances his way. Near the window, a boy no older than 10 fiddled with a handheld game console, his mother scolding him softly for ignoring his food. It was an unremarkable scene, yet Xavier couldn't shake the tension simmering beneath the surface. Becky returned with his coffee, setting it down with a clink. "Anything else?" "No, thank you." Xavier gave her a polite nod before she moved on, her gaze flicking toward the men in the corner as she walked away. Xavier wrapped his hands around the mug, the warmth seeping into his palms as he stared at the dark liquid. He could feel the unease in the room, unspoken but palpable, like the charged air before a storm. It wasn't outright hostility, no one had said anything to him, but he could sense the judgment, the whispered assumptions. In a town like Millbrooke, wealth didn't erase color. If anything, it made his presence even more jarring. The bell above the door jingled as another patron entered, and Xavier glanced up instinctively. A young police officer stepped in, his uniform crisp and his belt weighed down with tools of authority. His name tag read Daniels, and he carried himself with the air of someone used to being in charge. Daniels scanned the diner, his eyes landing on Xavier almost immediately. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by something colder. He walked over to the counter, positioning himself a few stools away. "Evening," Daniel said, his voice low but pointed. "Don't think I've seen you around here before." Xavier met his gaze evenly. "Just visiting." Daniels tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "You've got a fancy suit for a town like this. What brings you to Millbrooke?" "I grew up here," Xavier replied, keeping his tone calm. "Thought I'd come back and see how things are." Daniels leaned against the counter, his hand resting casually near his belt. "Well, things haven't changed much. Folks around here like to keep it that way." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Xavier didn't rise to the bait, instead taking a slow sip of his coffee. He'd dealt with men like Daniels before, men who wore their prejudice like a badge of honor, thinly veiled beneath polite words. Becky appeared again, her hands fidgeting as she refilled Daniels' mug. "Can I get you anything else, officer?" Daniels shook his head, his eyes never leaving Xavier. "Nah, just making sure everything's in order." Xavier set his mug down, his movements deliberate. "It's a nice town," he said, meeting Daniels' gaze. "But it could use a little help, some fresh ideas." Daniels chuckled, the sound sharp and humorless. "That right? And you're here to help, huh?" "I believe in giving back," Xavier said simply. "This town raised me. I want to see it thrive." Daniel's smirk deepened, but before he could respond, The boy near the window accidentally knocked over his drink, sending soda spilling across the table. His mother scrambled to clean it up, her apologies hurried and flustered. Xavier seized the moment, standing and pulling a few bills from his wallet. He placed them on the counter, nodding to Becky. "Thank you for the coffee." As he turned to leave, Daniels's voice followed him. "Don't go stirring up trouble, Mr. Shaw. Some things are better left as they are." Xavier paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. He didn't look back as he replied, his voice steady and firm. "Change is inevitable, officer, whether you like it or not." With that, he stepped into the cool night air, the door swinging shut behind him. The tension in the diner didn't dissipate. It lingered, thick and unspoken, as Xavier walked back to his car. He had come to Millbrooke with the best of intentions, but tonight had reminded him of the challenges he would face. Change was never easy, especially in a town so resistant to it. But Xavier wasn't one to back down. Not from systemic prejudice, not from men like Daniels, and certainly not from the weight of history pressing against his shoulders. He had a purpose here, and he wouldn't let anything, or anyone, stand in his way. Xavier Shaw's footsteps echoed across the empty sidewalk as he walked to his car, the crisp night air biting at his face. The encounter with Officer Daniels lingered in his mind, stirring a quiet unease he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the first time Xavier had faced this kind of thinly veiled hostility, but being back in Millbrooke gave the experience an edge sharper than he'd anticipated. This wasn't just any small town, this was the place that had shaped him, both in spite of and because of its flaws. Sliding into his car, Xavier took a moment to steady himself. The hum of the engine as it came to life was a familiar comfort, but the tension in his chest refused to subside. His hand rested on the steering wheel for a moment, fingers drumming lightly as he mulled over Daniel's words. Some things are better left as they are. He couldn't ignore the warning behind them. Millbrooke had always been a town slow to accept change. It thrived on unspoken rules and tight-knit circles, leaving little room for those who didn't fit its mold. Xavier had left to escape that suffocating world. But now he was back, determined to do more than just exist on its margins. As he drove to the modest rental home he'd arranged for his stay, his mind wandered to the following day's plans. He was scheduled to meet with local officials to discuss his proposal, a redevelopment initiative aimed at revitalizing Millbrooke's struggling economy. The initiative was ambitious, but thoughtful. Small business grants, infrastructure improvements, and scholarships for local students. It was his way of giving back, but Xavier knew his ideas wouldn't be universally welcomed. By the time he reached the house, exhaustion was beginning to creep in. The home was small, but clean, its simple exterior a stark contrast to the luxury condos he was used to. Yet, stepping inside, Xavier felt a sense of grounding. He dropped his bag near the door and collapsed onto the couch, his mind still racing. The next morning, Xavier arrived at Millbrooke's town hall, a historic building that bore the weight of its years in its chipped paint and sagging columns. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. But Xavier had learned the value of arriving early. He strode up the steps with purpose, his briefcase in hand, and a fresh sense of optimism in his chest. Inside, the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with tightly curled hair, looked up from her desk. Her expression shifted from polite indifference to something colder as her eyes scanned his tailored suit. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she gestured curtly toward the seating area. "You can wait over there," she said, her tone clipped. "We'll call you when we're ready." "Thank you," Xavier replied, his voice calm. He took a seat in one of the worn leather chairs, his posture relaxed but alert. The room buzzed with quiet activity as other officials and staff members moved in and out of the hallway. Xavier noticed the glances, some curious, others skeptical. He caught snippets of murmured conversations that stopped just short of outright disrespect. Who's he supposed to be? Probably here to complain about something. You think he's lost? Xavier remained composed, though a flicker of irritation stirred in his chest. This wasn't new. He had learned to navigate spaces where his presence was questioned, where assumptions about him overshadowed his achievements, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. At 10:15, a man in a wrinkled blazer finally approached. His name tag read Fred Walker, town manager. He extended a hand, his grip firm but perfunctory. "Mr. Shaw, is it?" he said, his voice heavy with forced politeness. "Follow me." The meeting room was a small, stuffy space, with mismatched chairs arranged around a scuffed conference table. Xavier set his briefcase down and began distributing copies of his proposal to the small group of officials already seated. As he spoke, explaining his vision for the redevelopment initiative, he noticed the way they exchanged glances: dismissive, skeptical, or outright uninterested. "I think we can all agree Millbrooke has the potential to thrive again," Xavier said, keeping his tone measured. "This plan isn't just about bringing in investors, it's about empowering the community, local businesses, families." One of the officials, a gray-haired man with a badge that identified him as Councilman Harris, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "And what exactly qualifies you to propose something like this?" Xavier met Harris's gaze evenly. "I've spent over a decade building one of the country's most successful tech firms. Innovate Solutions employs hundreds and funds numerous community programs. I know how to manage resources and foster growth." Harris raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "That's impressive on paper, but Millbrooke's different from the big cities you're used to, Mr. Shaw. We don't need outsiders telling us how to run things." The word outsider hung heavy in the air, its meaning unmistakable. Xavier felt a familiar burn in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "With all due respect, Councilman, I'm not an outsider. I grew up here, and I want to see Millbrooke thrive, not just survive." Another voice cut in, sharp and dismissive. "If you cared so much about this town, why'd you leave in the first place?" The question came from Patricia Langley, the owner of several small businesses in town. Her tone was pointed, her gaze hard. Xavier took a breath, steadying himself before responding. "I left because I saw opportunities elsewhere," he said simply. "But I've never forgotten where I came from. That's why I'm here, to give back." Patricia scoffed, shaking her head. "You think money fixes everything, don't you? Millbrooke doesn't need fancy ideas or big city solutions. We need people who understand this town, who've stayed and worked through its problems, not someone who ran off and made it big." Xavier's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not here to replace anyone or impose anything. I'm here to offer resources and ideas. The rest is up to you." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken biases and resistance. Xavier could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him, each dismissive glance and skeptical question cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. The meeting ended without a clear resolution. As Xavier gathered his things, Harris spoke again, his tone curt. "We'll consider your proposal and get back to you." Xavier nodded, offering a polite but firm, "Thank you." He knew the dismissal when he heard it, but he also knew this wasn't the end. Millbrooke was stubborn. Yes. But so was he. As Xavier stepped outside, the bright sunlight felt almost jarring against the heaviness of the morning. He leaned against his car for a moment, letting the warmth seep into his skin as he processed the meeting. Frustration churned in his chest, but so did resolve. The faint sound of footsteps drew his attention, and he looked up to see Officer Daniels leaning casually against a lamppost, watching him. There was a smugness in his posture, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "Rough meeting?" Daniels called out, his tone laced with mock concern. Xavier didn't respond immediately. Instead, he straightened, his gaze steady as he locked eyes with the officer. "Just part of the process," he said coolly. Daniels smirked, pushing off the lamppost and sauntering closer. "You know, folks around here don't take kindly to big ideas, especially from someone who doesn't quite fit the mold." Xavier's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his voice remained calm. "I'm not here to fit anyone's mold, officer. I'm here to make a difference." Daniels tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Well, just be careful. People in Millbrooke like their routines. Shake things up too much, and you might find yourself on the wrong side of a problem." The implied threat lingered between them, sharp and unspoken. Xavier didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice steady and firm. "Thanks for the advice, officer. But I've dealt with bigger problems than this town can throw at me." Daniels's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he turned and walked away. Xavier watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. The day had been a series of small battles, each one chipping away at his patience, but he refused to let them break him. As he climbed into his car and started the engine, Xavier made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't done with Millbrooke. Not by a long shot. The sun hung low in the sky as Xavier Shaw drove down Millbrooke's main street, his mind racing with the events of the day. The town's resistance to his proposal wasn't surprising, but the undercurrent of hostility had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. It wasn't just skepticism about his plans. It was about him, his presence, his identity. He could feel it in every dismissive glance, every veiled remark. As he passed the courthouse, he noticed a small gathering near the steps. A crowd of about 20 people stood in a loose semicircle, their faces animated as they listened to someone speaking. Curious, Xavier pulled over and stepped out, walking toward the group. At the center of the commotion was Officer Daniels, his voice carrying with practiced authority. "Just saying we need to protect our way of life," Daniels said, his tone measured but inflammatory. "People come in with big ideas, thinking they know better than us, but they don't understand what makes this town special." The crowd murmured in agreement, nodding along as Daniels continued. "We've seen it before. Outsiders trying to change things, only to leave us worse off. We don't need someone telling us how to run our town." Xavier stood at the edge of the crowd, his jaw tightening as Daniels' words washed over him. It was clear who the officer was referring to, even if his name wasn't mentioned. The implication was sharp enough to cut. A man in the crowd, older and weathered, raised his voice. "Heard he's got money, though maybe he thinks he can just buy his way in." Daniels chuckled, his eyes flicking briefly to where Xavier stood. "Money doesn't mean much if you don't know how to use it. This town doesn't need flashy solutions. It needs people who understand its roots." Xavier stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Respectfully, Officer Daniels, change doesn't erase roots, it strengthens them. That's what I'm trying to do here." The crowd turned, their murmurs falling silent as Xavier's presence loomed large among them. Daniels' smile didn't waver, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. "Well, speak of the devil," Daniels drawled, his tone dripping with mock cordiality. "Mr. Shaw, how nice of you to join us. Seems like you've been making quite an impression around town." "I'd like to think so," Xavier replied evenly. "But it seems we have different ideas about what's best for Millbrooke." Daniels folded his arms, his expression hardening. "What's best for Millbrooke is keeping its traditions intact. We don't need someone swooping in with big promises and no follow-through." Xavier stepped closer, his gaze unflinching. "I'm here to invest in this town, not take from it. If you want to have a constructive conversation about that, I'm happy to engage, but spreading fear and misinformation doesn't help anyone." The crowd shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the two men. Daniels' smile faltered for a brief moment, before he recovered, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You're awfully confident for someone who hasn't lived here in years," Daniels said. "Maybe you've forgotten how things work around here." "I haven't forgotten anything," Xavier replied, "including the fact that fear of change has held this town back for decades. It's time to move forward." Before Daniels could respond, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder as another figure stepped forward, a young man in a worn flannel shirt. His name was Mitchell, and Xavier recognized him as the owner of a struggling hardware store on the edge of town. "Wait a minute," Mitchell said, his voice hesitant but clear. "What exactly is wrong with trying to improve things? My business could use some help, and if Mr. Shaw's plan can provide that, why not give it a chance?" Daniels turned to Mitchell, his jaw tightening. "Be careful, Mitchell, change isn't always for the better. You let people like him in, and before you know it, they're running the place." Mitchell looked back at Daniels, his brow furrowing. "Or maybe they're just trying to help. Not everyone's out to take something from us." The crowd buzzed with murmurs of agreement and dissent, the tension crackling like static electricity. Daniels' eyes darkened, and he took a step toward Mitchell, his voice dropping into a warning tone. "You sure you want to pick this fight, Mitchell?" "I'm not picking a fight," Mitchell replied, his voice steady, despite the weight of Daniels' stare. "I'm just saying maybe we should listen instead of assuming the worst." Xavier felt a flicker of hope at Mitchell's words, but the moment was short-lived. Daniels turned back to Xavier, his expression cold and calculating. "You've got a lot of people fooled, Mr. Shaw," Daniels said, "but not me. I see through you." Xavier's patience finally snapped. He stepped forward, his voice rising just enough to carry over the crowd. "And what exactly do you see, officer? Someone who doesn't look like you. Someone who challenges the status quo. I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to help this town. But if you want to make this personal, go ahead. It says more about you than it does about me." The crowd fell silent, the weight of Xavier's words hanging in the air. Daniel's face hardened, his composure cracking as his hand instinctively moved toward the radio on his belt. "That's enough," Daniel said, his voice tight. "You're causing a disturbance." "I'm speaking the truth," Xavier replied. "If that's a disturbance, maybe it's time to take a hard look at what you're protecting." The tension reached its breaking point as Daniel stepped forward, his voice sharp. "I said that's enough. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct." The crowd gasped as Daniels grabbed Xavier's arm, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. Xavier didn't resist, his jaw clenching as he felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around his wrists. "This is ridiculous," Mitchell said, stepping forward. "He wasn't doing anything wrong." "Step back, Mitchell," Daniels barked. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," Mitchell shot back. "You can't just arrest someone for speaking their mind." Daniels ignored him, pulling Xavier toward the squad car parked nearby. The crowd followed, their murmurs growing louder as they watched the scene unfold. Xavier held his head high, refusing to let the humiliation break him, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. As Daniel shoved him into the back of the car, Xavier met Mitchell's gaze through the crowd. There was fear in Mitchell's eyes, but also resolve. Xavier gave him a small nod, silently urging him to keep speaking up. The squad car door slammed shut, and Daniel slid into the driver's seat, his expression grim. "You should have stayed in the city, Shaw," he said, his voice low. "Millbrooke doesn't need people like you." Xavier didn't respond, his mind racing. The stakes had shifted, and he knew this moment would be a turning point, not just for him, but for the town. As the car pulled away, the crowd's voices faded into the background, replaced by the rhythmic thrum of his heartbeat. He wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't go quietly. The chill of the holding cell bit into Xavier's skin, but it was nothing compared to the sting of humiliation coursing through him. The faint buzz of a fluorescent light above his head was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. He sat on the hard bench, his back straight, his mind racing. This wasn't just about him. He knew that his arrest was a message, a power play designed to undermine him and warn others not to challenge the status quo he'd grown up in Millbrooke. He recognized the subtle, insidious patterns of its systemic prejudice. But this was different. This was overt. He took a steadying breath, forcing himself to think Daniels had escalated this situation. But the officer's actions were reckless. If Xavier played this right, he could turn the arrest into leverage. He just needed to stay calm and focused. A few miles away, Mitchell sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel as he replayed the scene outside the diner. His knuckles turned white as the memory of Daniels forcing Xavier into the squad car burned in his mind. Mitchell had always kept his head down, avoiding conflict, but this felt like too much. He couldn't shake the look on Xavier's face, the resolve beneath the indignity. For the first time in a long time, Mitchell felt compelled to act. Pulling out his phone, he hesitated before dialing. The contact on the screen read, Rachel Porter. Local journalist Mitchell and Rachel had gone to high school together, and though they weren't close, he knew she had a reputation for uncovering uncomfortable truths. "Rachel, it's Mitchell. I've got a story for you," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You're going to want to hear this." Back at the station, Daniels leaned back in his chair, a smug grin playing on his lips. He watched Xavier on the monitor, the grainy black and white feed casting an almost ghostly pallor over his composed expression. "You think you're so smart," Daniels muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with disdain. He reached for his coffee, savoring the moment. To him, this was a victory, a way to put Xavier Shaw, the so-called savior of Millbrooke, in his place. The door creaked open, and Sheriff Wilkins stepped inside. He was an older man, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of too many compromises. He paused, glancing at the monitor before turning to Daniels. "What's this about?" Wilkins asked, his tone weary. "Disorderly conduct," Daniels replied, leaning back in his chair. "Shaw was stirring up trouble, causing a scene. Wilkins frowned, crossing his arms. He was talking, Daniels. That's not a crime. Daniels shrugged, feigning nonchalance. Depends on the kind of talking. He was riling people up, questioning authority. I did what needed to be done. The sheriff's gaze hardened. What you did was put us in a mess. You think this won't blow back on us? Shaw's not some nobody. He's got influence, connections. This could get ugly. Daniel's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with bravado. Let it. He doesn't belong here, Wilkins. People like him think they can waltz in and fix things they don't understand. Wilkins sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm warning you, Daniels, you've crossed a line. Clean this up before it gets out of hand. As Wilkins left, Daniels' confidence wavered. He stared at the monitor, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Xavier was strategizing. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. The door creaked open, and a young officer entered, his expression nervous. Mr. Shaw, the officer said, clearing his throat. You've got a visitor. Xavier raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. He stood, smoothing his suit jacket, as the officer escorted him to the small visitation room. Inside, Mitchell stood by the table, his hands in his pockets, his face a mixture of guilt and determination. Mitchell, Xavier said, his voice steady. What are you doing here? Mitchell shifted uncomfortably before speaking. Look, I know you don't owe me anything, but I couldn't just sit by what Daniels did, what this town does. It's wrong, and people need to know. Xavier studied him for a moment before nodding. I appreciate that. What's your plan? I called Rachel Porter, Mitchell admitted. She's coming down here to cover this. If Daniels wants to make a spectacle, let's give him one. Xavier allowed himself a small smile. That's bold, Mitchell. But this isn't just about me. It's about this town and the people stuck in its grip. Mitchell's gaze sharpened. Then let's shake it loose. As Rachel Porter pulled up to the station, her car was greeted by the buzz of a growing crowd. News of Xavier's arrest had spread, and people were beginning to gather outside, their murmurs turning into chants of support. Some held signs reading, "Justice for Xavier" and "No change without progress." Rachel stepped out, her camera in hand, her mind already racing with angles for the story. She spotted Mitchell in the crowd, and made her way over. "Mitchell," she called out, "fill me in." Mitchell quickly explained the situation, his words tumbling over each other. Rachel's expression darkened as she listened, her journalistic instincts firing on all cylinders. Inside, Daniels watched the scene unfold from the window, his jaw tightening. The growing crowd was the last thing he wanted, but he couldn't back down now. His career, his authority, everything was on the line. In the visitation room, Xavier leaned forward, his voice low but resolute. This isn't just about clearing my name, it's about exposing the deeper issues here. Daniels is a symptom, not the disease. Mitchell nodded, his respect for Xavier deepening with every word. I'll do whatever I can to help. Before they could continue, the door burst open, and Daniels stormed in, his face red with anger. Time's up, Daniels barked. You're done playing hero, Shaw. Xavier stood, his posture calm but commanding. I don't need to play hero, Daniels. The truth speaks for itself. Daniels stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think you're untouchable? This town chews up people like you? Xavier didn't flinch. And I rebuild what's left. You don't scare me, Daniels. You never did. Outside, the crowd's chants grew louder as Rachel began filming. She captured the energy of the gathering, the faces of those demanding justice. It was a moment Millbrooke couldn't ignore, a breaking point in its long, fraught history. As the tension reached its peak, the station doors opened and Xavier emerged, flanked by Daniels and another officer. The crowd erupted, their cheers drowning out Daniels' futile attempts to maintain control. Rachel stepped forward, her camera trained on Xavier. Mr. Shaw, do you have a statement? Xavier paused, looking out at the sea of faces. His voice was steady, clear, and filled with conviction. This isn't about me, he began. It's about accountability, fairness, and the future of this town. Millbrooke deserves better. And together, we'll make it better. The crowd roared in approval, their voices a wave of support that washed over him. For the first time since his arrest, Xavier felt the tides turning in his favor. But as he stepped forward, his gaze met Daniel's, who stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression dark and unreadable. The battle was far from over, and Xavier knew the real fight was just beginning. The crowd outside the Millbrooke police station had swelled, their chants rising in unison, calling for justice. The energy in the air was electric, crackling with tension and anticipation. Xavier Shaw stood tall, his sharp suit slightly wrinkled, but his resolve unshaken. He scanned the faces in the crowd, seeing a mixture of support, curiosity, and quiet defiance. He knew the stakes were at their peak now. This moment would define not just his own fight, but the future of this town. Inside the station, Officer Daniels paced in his office, the blinds drawn tightly over the windows. The muffled chants from outside grated on his nerves. His confident facade had begun to crack, exposing the seething anger beneath. He turned sharply as Sheriff Wilkins entered, his face grim. "You've created a mess," Wilkins said, his tone a mix of frustration and fatigue. "This has gone far beyond anything we can control." "There's a journalist out there, Daniels." "A journalist?" Daniels scowled. "Let them write their stories. People around here don't read that garbage anyway." Wilkins shook his head, stepping closer. "This isn't about the papers. This is about you turning a simple disagreement into a public spectacle, and now Shaw's walking out of here looking like a hero while you—" He gestured toward Daniel's tense figure. "Look like a petty bully." Daniel's face darkened. "He's manipulating everyone, Sheriff, coming in here with his money and his ideas, pretending he cares about this town, but he doesn't belong here. He never has." Wilkins stared at Daniels for a long moment, his jaw tightening. "If you can't see past your own prejudice, you're going to drag us all down with you." Daniels didn't reply. Instead, he grabbed his belt and stormed out, his boots echoing against the tiled floor. Outside, Xavier stepped down from the station steps, the cheers of the crowd washing over him. Rachel Porter was in front of him, microphone in hand, as her camera operator followed closely. "Mr. Shaw, how do you plan to address the systemic issues you've highlighted here today?" Xavier hesitated. He could feel the weight of every word he was about to say. "This isn't about me," he said finally, his voice steady but passionate. "It's about holding people accountable and creating a space where fairness and equality are the foundations of our community. Millbrooke has to decide if it wants to be a town that grows or one that remains trapped by its own fears." Before Rachel could ask another question, a voice cut through the crowd like a blade. "Big words for a man who's done nothing but cause trouble." The crowd parted as Daniels stepped forward, his face a mask of barely contained fury. His hand rested on his holstered gun, the gesture subtle but deliberate. The crowd grew quieter, their murmurs giving way to a tense silence. Xavier turned to face Daniels, his expression calm but unyielding. "Officer Daniels," he said evenly, "are you here to continue abusing your authority, or would you like to have a real conversation?" The crowd stirred, sensing the confrontation brewing. Rachel's camera turned toward Daniels. Capturing his every movement, Daniels sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know a damn thing about this town or its people. I know enough to see that your actions today aren't about the law or protecting this town," Xavier said, his voice rising slightly. "They're about maintaining control through fear and intimidation, but the people of Millbrooke deserve better." Daniels took a step closer, his body language aggressive. "You've got a lot of nerve, Shaw, coming here, stirring up trouble and trying to make me the bad guy." "You've done that all on your own," Xavier replied sharply. He turned to the crowd, his voice ringing out. "How many of you have experienced what I have today? How many of you have been silenced, dismissed, or punished for trying to create change?" The crowd's murmurs grew louder, rippling with agreement. Daniel's face twisted in frustration. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, waving it in the air. "You want to talk about accountability, Shaw?" he spat. "What about this?" He unfolded the paper, revealing what looked like a set of legal documents. "This is a foreclosure notice from when you left Millbrooke years ago. Your family abandoned their debts, leaving this town worse off, and now you come back, pretending to care?" Xavier froze, his breath catching in his throat. The accusation stung. Not because it was entirely untrue, but because it was a deliberate distortion of the truth. His family had struggled financially when he was a teenager, barely scraping by before leaving Millbrooke for a better life elsewhere. They'd done what they could, but the weight of systemic inequality had been too much to overcome. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "You're right," he said finally, his voice quieter, but no less firm. "My family did struggle. We left because we didn't see another way, but that's exactly why I'm here now, to make sure no one else has to leave their home, because this town refused to help them when they needed it most." The crowd erupted into applause, their support drowning out Daniel's next words. Rachel stepped closer, her camera capturing every moment. "Officer Daniels," she said, her tone sharp, "is this the kind of leadership Millbrooke's law enforcement represents, attacking individuals instead of addressing systemic issues?" Daniels's face reddened, his hand tightening on his holster. "You don't know what you're talking about." "No, Daniels," Xavier said, stepping forward. "You don't know what we're talking about. This isn't about you or me. It's about what's right for this town, and if you can't be part of the solution, then you're part of the problem." The crowd's cheers grew deafening, their energy surging around Xavier like a wave. Daniels looked around, his confidence crumbling, as he realized he'd lost the room. His hand dropped from his holster, his shoulders slumping slightly. But Xavier wasn't done. He turned to Rachel, his voice clear and resolute. "Millbrooke deserves leaders who fight for its people, not against them, and I intend to make sure that happens." Daniels glared at him, his jaw tightening. "You think you've won?" he hissed. "This town won't change overnight." "No," Xavier replied, his gaze unwavering. "But it will change." The crowd erupted once more, their voices a powerful chorus of unity. For the first time, Xavier felt the tide truly shifting. The fight wasn't over, but he had planted a seed of hope, determination, and accountability. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over Millbrooke, Xavier stood tall among the crowd, ready to face whatever came next. The atmosphere inside Millbrooke's town hall was charged, every corner brimming with tension. The makeshift assembly had gathered hastily, prompted by the uproar following Xavier Shaw's arrest. Rows of folding chairs filled with locals created a restless sea of murmurs, while the town's key figures, Councilman Harris, Sheriff Wilkins, and a grim-faced Officer Daniels, sat in a raised area at the front. The room was too small to contain the collective energy. People spilled out into the hallways and onto the steps outside. Xavier stood at the center of it all, his shoulders squared and his chin held high. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of unchecked power that had plagued Millbrooke for generations. The stakes weren't just his reputation, but the possibility of real change. Officer Daniels sat stiffly behind a long wooden table, his arms crossed. His eyes bored into Xavier with the intensity of a predator guarding its territory. To his left, Councilman Harris adjusted his glasses, a veneer of neutrality failing to conceal the tension on his face. The town clerk called the meeting to order, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "This session is an emergency hearing to address recent events involving Officer Daniels and the arrest of Mr. Xavier Shaw. Mr. Shaw, you've requested to speak?" Xavier stepped forward, his calm demeanor belying the storm brewing inside him. He held a folder of documents in his hand, gripping it tightly as if it anchored him to the moment. "Thank you," Xavier said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his conviction. "I want to make it clear that I'm not here to air grievances. I'm here because this town deserves better. The people here deserve transparency, fairness, and leadership that reflects their values, not outdated prejudices and abuse of power." A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd, murmurs of support rising before the clerk silenced them with a tap of her gavel. Xavier's words hung in the air, and he let the weight of them sink in before continuing. "Officer Daniels," Xavier said, turning his gaze directly on him. "You've accused me of causing disorder, of disrupting the so-called peace of this town, but what you've really done is use your badge to silence a voice that challenges your authority. This isn't about me being out of line, it's about me not staying in the place you think I belong." Daniels leaned forward, his expression twisting with anger. "You think you can come here and talk about authority? You're the one trying to turn this town upside down with your big city ideas and your arrogance. Authority is earned through trust and integrity," Xavier shot back, his voice rising slightly. "It's not a weapon to be wielded against people who don't fit your narrow idea of what Millbrooke should be." The room erupted into murmurs again, and this time the clerk struggled to bring it back to order. Daniel's face flushed red, and he slammed his fist on the table, causing papers to scatter. "You don't know a damn thing about this town," Daniels roared. "You left it behind like the rest of your kind when things got tough, and now you come back pretending to care?" The venom in Daniel's words silenced the crowd. The weight of his prejudice laid bare for everyone to see. Xavier didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his voice calm but cutting through the room like steel. "And there it is," Xavier said. "The truth. This isn't about law or order. It's about the fear of someone like me having a voice. About someone like me daring to believe this town can be more than its past." Daniels opened his mouth to retort, but Xavier cut him off, raising the folder in his hand. "You want to talk about who cares for this town? Let's talk about you, Officer Daniels." He opened the folder and pulled out a series of documents, holding them up for the room to see. "These are reports of misconduct filed against you over the years, complaints from citizens who say you've used your position to intimidate and harass them, and not just me. People who've lived here all their lives, people you've sworn to protect." Gasps rippled through the room, and Rachel Porter's camera zoomed in on the papers in Xavier's hands. Daniel's face twisted in rage, but there was no denying the impact of Xavier's words. "That's enough," Daniels barked, standing so abruptly that his chair toppled backward. He pointed a finger at Xavier, his voice shaking with fury. "You don't get to stand there and accuse me of anything." "I'm not accusing you," Xavier said firmly. "The evidence speaks for itself, and the people of Millbrooke deserve to know who's been holding them back." Daniels lunged forward, his fists clenched, but Sheriff Wilkins stepped in, placing a firm hand on his chest. "That's enough, Daniels," Wilkins said, his voice low and commanding. "You've done enough damage." For a moment, Daniels froze, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. Then he jerked away from Wilkins and turned to the crowd, his voice rising in desperation. "You're all being fooled. He doesn't care about this town. He just wants to make himself look good. Or maybe he wants to make a difference," a voice called out from the crowd. It was Mitchell, stepping forward with an uncharacteristic boldness. "You've had years to do the right thing, Daniels, and you haven't. Maybe it's time for someone else to step up." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy surging behind Xavier. Daniels looked around, his confidence crumbling as he realized he'd lost the room. Xavier turned to the town officials seated at the front. "This isn't just about Officer Daniels. It's about the systems that allow people like him to operate without accountability. If this town wants to move forward, it has to start by holding those in power to the same standards as everyone else." Councilman Harris shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Xavier's gaze. Sheriff Wilkins nodded slowly, his expression resigned. "We'll conduct an investigation," Wilkins said, his voice heavy. "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended pending review." The announcement sent a ripple of relief through the crowd, but Xavier knew this was only the beginning. Daniels stood rigid, his jaw clenched as he stared daggers at Xavier. "You think this is over?" Daniels muttered, his voice low enough that only Xavier could hear. "You have no idea what you've started." Xavier met his gaze without flinching. "Neither do you." As the crowd began to disperse, Rachel approached Xavier, her camera operator still filming. "Mr. Shaw, do you feel justice has been served here today?" Xavier sighed, running a hand over his face. "Justice isn't served in a day, but this is a start." He turned back to the crowd, watching as they lingered in small groups, their conversations buzzing with the possibility of change. For the first time in a long time, Xavier felt a glimmer of hope, for Millbrooke and for himself. But as he stepped outside into the cool night air, the weight of Daniel's parting words lingered in his mind. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The following morning, the town hall buzzed with an energy Millbrooke hadn't felt in years. Word of the confrontation had spread, and the suspension of Officer Daniels sent shockwaves through the community. For the first time, people openly questioned not just Daniels's actions, but the systems that had protected him for so long. Whispers of accountability and reform echoed in conversations over breakfast tables and in shop fronts. Xavier Shaw sat in the modest living room of his rental home, scrolling through the flood of messages on his phone. Some were from old friends in Millbrooke, thanking him for standing up. Others were from strangers who'd heard his story and reached out with words of encouragement. A few were less kind, calling him an agitator or worse, but Xavier didn't let those bother him. The tide was turning. A sharp knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Mitchell stood there, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee. "I figured you could use this," Mitchell said, offering one with a sheepish grin. Xavier accepted it with a nod. "Thanks, Mitchell. Come on in." They sat on the worn couch, the silence between them comfortable, but weighted with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Mitchell spoke. "People are talking," he said, "about what happened last night, about Daniels. A lot of folks are angry, but I think some of them are starting to get it." "That's good," Xavier said, taking a sip of his coffee. "It's a start." Mitchell nodded, staring into his cup. "I've been thinking about what you said about standing up. I've lived in this town my whole life, Xavier. I've seen things, things that didn't sit right, but I always told myself it wasn't my fight, that nothing would change anyway." "And now?" Xavier asked, his voice steady but curious. Mitchell looked up, his gaze firm. "Now I think it's time we start making it our fight." Xavier smiled, a small but genuine expression of gratitude. "You've got more power than you realize, Mitchell. People listen to you. If you keep pushing for change, others will follow." Mitchell nodded, the determination in his eyes growing. "What about you? What's next for you?" Xavier leaned back, his expression contemplative. "I came here thinking I'd just launch a redevelopment initiative and call it a day. But now, I think there's more work to be done. Not just rebuilding buildings or businesses, but rebuilding trust, rebuilding the idea that Millbrooke can be a place for everyone." Later that day, Xavier met with Sheriff Wilkins at the police station. The sheriff's office was small and cluttered, the desk piled high with paperwork and old coffee cups. Wilkins looked up as Xavier entered, his face lined with exhaustion. "Mr. Shaw," Wilkins said, gesturing to a chair. "Thanks for coming." Xavier sat, his posture relaxed but alert. "What's the latest on Daniels?" Wilkins sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "He's fighting the suspension, of course, but the evidence you brought forward makes it clear we can't let him back on the force. I've already contacted the state's Internal Affairs Department to start a formal investigation." "That's a good start," Xavier said. "But Daniels isn't the only problem. The culture that allowed him to act the way he did needs to change too." Wilkins nodded slowly. "You're right. I've been in this job long enough to see how things have gotten out of hand. We've let too much slide because it was easier than rocking the boat. But after last night, I think the boat needs rocking." Xavier leaned forward, his voice steady, but firm. "Sheriff, if you're serious about change, I'm willing to help. I can provide funding for community programs, outreach, training, whatever it takes to rebuild trust between the department and the people." Wilkins looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "That means a lot, Shaw. But I think the first step is admitting we've failed. If we don't do that, no amount of money or programs will fix things." Over the next few weeks, the momentum for change grew. Daniel's suspension turned into a full dismissal after an independent review corroborated the allegations of misconduct against him. Rachel Porter's coverage of the story spread far beyond Millbrooke, sparking conversations about small-town corruption and the importance of accountability. Xavier became a central figure in the push for reform, not just in Millbrooke, but in similar towns facing the same struggles. He worked closely with local leaders and residents to create initiatives aimed at fostering inclusivity and opportunity. Community forums became regular events, giving people a space to voice their concerns and ideas. One evening, as Xavier walked through Millbrooke's Main Street, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: hope. The boarded-up shops were beginning to reopen, some with new owners and fresh coats of paint. Families strolled along the sidewalks, their conversations filled with optimism instead of resignation. But not everything was tied up neatly. Xavier knew there were still those who resisted change, who clung to the old ways out of fear or spite. He'd received his share of threats, anonymous letters, menacing looks from certain corners of town. And while Daniels was gone, the scars he left behind weren't easily healed. Still, Xavier remained steadfast. He'd learned that progress wasn't about instant victories, but about persistence. Every small step mattered, every conversation, every ally gained, and for the first time in a long time, Xavier felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in hues of gold and purple, Xavier stood on the steps of the courthouse. A small crowd had gathered for a community event, and he was set to speak. Mitchell stood nearby, a quiet but constant source of support, while Rachel Porter's camera captured the moment. Xavier stepped up to the microphone, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "When I came back to Millbrooke, I didn't know what to expect," he began. "I thought I'd stay for a little while, make a few changes, and move on. But what I found here was more than just challenges. It was potential for growth, for healing, for something better." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd. Change is never easy. It's uncomfortable, it's messy, but it's necessary, and it doesn't happen because of one person or one moment. It happens because a community decides it's ready to move forward together. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers carrying into the evening air. Xavier stepped back, his heart full. He didn't have all the answers, but he had something just as important: resolve. As he walked away from the podium, Mitchell clapped him on the back. "You really think this town can change?" he asked. Xavier smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't just think it can, I know it will." The soft glow of the evening sun bathed Millbrooke in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across its cobblestone streets. For the first time in years, the town felt alive, not with the bustling noise of a city, but with a quieter, deeper energy. It was the hum of possibility, the first stirrings of change breaking through the cracks of tradition. Xavier Shaw stood on the steps of the old courthouse, watching as families walked along Main Street, their laughter punctuating the warm air. The sight brought a small smile to his face, but his expression carried the weight of the battles that had brought them here. For Xavier, the past weeks had been transformative. He'd come to Millbrooke as a man of success and vision, determined to give back to the community that had shaped him. But what he hadn't anticipated was how much the fight for justice would reshape him in turn. The confrontation with Officer Daniels, the rallying of allies like Mitchell, and the growing support of Millbrooke's residents had forced him to dig deeper into his resolve and redefine his purpose. He was no longer just a CEO with a redevelopment plan. He had become a leader in the truest sense, a voice for those who had been silenced, a beacon for those who needed hope. Xavier's journey had not been easy. Standing up to Officer Daniels and the entrenched systems of power in Millbrooke had come at a cost. The threats, the whispers, the skepticism from some corners of the town, they had tested his patience and his faith. But those challenges had also revealed something greater: the strength that comes from standing firm in one's convictions. Reflecting on his path, Xavier realized how much he had grown. The anger he'd felt after his unjust arrest had evolved into something more constructive. Instead of letting the injustice consume him, he'd channeled that energy into action. He'd learned to navigate the delicate balance of persistence and diplomacy, understanding that real change required not just boldness, but also collaboration. Xavier's interactions with people like Mitchell had reinforced his belief in the power of community. Mitchell's evolution from a hesitant bystander to an active advocate mirrored the transformation Xavier hoped to see in Millbrooke itself. It reminded him that change didn't happen in isolation. It required collective courage, one voice inspiring another until the silence was broken. The events in Millbrooke had exposed more than just Officer Daniels' corruption. They had laid bare the systemic issues that had long plagued the town: racial prejudice, abuse of power, and the inertia of tradition. Daniels was just one man, but the culture that allowed him to thrive was far-reaching and deeply ingrained. Xavier knew that his struggle in Millbrooke reflected broader societal issues. Across the country, small towns and big cities alike grappled with the same questions. How do we hold power accountable? How do we dismantle systems built on exclusion and fear? How do we create spaces where everyone belongs? These were not questions with easy answers, but Xavier believed they were worth asking. His fight in Millbrooke was a microcosm of a larger battle for equity and justice, one that required the participation of many. It wasn't just about removing bad actors like Daniels. It was about rebuilding systems from the ground up, ensuring that fairness and compassion were at their core. The impact of Xavier's efforts was already visible. Daniel's dismissal had sent a clear message: accountability was no longer optional. Sheriff Wilkins, spurred by Xavier's challenge, had begun implementing reforms within the police department, including bias training and community oversight. These changes were small but significant steps toward rebuilding trust. The ripple effects extended beyond law enforcement. Businesses in Millbrooke, inspired by the growing sense of unity, had started participating in Xavier's redevelopment initiative. The scholarships he funded were helping local students envision futures they hadn't thought possible. Community forums became a space for honest conversations, breaking down barriers that had divided neighbors for years. But perhaps the most powerful change was the shift in mindset. People who had once accepted Millbrooke's stagnation as inevitable were beginning to believe in the possibility of something better. They were finding their voices, standing up for what they deserved, and working together to build a brighter future. As Xavier watched the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a mixture of pride and resolve. The fight in Millbrooke was far from over. There were still barriers to overcome, resistance to face, and wounds to heal. But the progress they had made was undeniable, and it fueled his determination to keep going. For Xavier, this was just the beginning. He planned to stay in Millbrooke longer than he'd originally intended, continuing to work with the community to ensure the changes they'd started would take root. Beyond that, he saw potential to replicate their efforts in other towns facing similar struggles. His vision had expanded, and he was ready to meet the challenge. Xavier's story is one of resilience, not just his own, but that of an entire community. It's a reminder that change is possible, even in places where it feels like the odds are stacked against you. It's proof that one voice, joined by others, can disrupt even the most entrenched systems. But his story is also a call to action. It challenges us to look at our own communities and ask hard questions. Where do we see injustice? Where can we make a difference? How can we use our voices, our skills, and our resources to build a better world? Change doesn't come easily, and it doesn't come overnight. It requires persistence, courage, and a willingness to face discomfort. But as Xavier learned, it's worth every moment of struggle. As the stars began to twinkle above Millbrooke, Xavier walked back to his car. The streetlights cast a warm glow on the sidewalk, and the hum of life in the town filled the air. He paused, looking back at the courthouse steps, where so much had unfolded. For a long time, Millbrooke had felt like a place he couldn't return to. A town defined by its flaws, its unwillingness to change. But now, it felt different. It felt like a town finding its way, one step at a time. Xavier climbed into his car, the engine purring to life. As he drove down the quiet streets, a sense of peace settled over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Millbrooke was worth fighting for, and so was every other place that had been written off, ignored, or left behind. Because progress isn't just a dream, it's a choice. And Xavier Shaw was ready to keep choosing it, one day, one town, one voice at a time.